Deep in the Russian steppe, close enough to the Kazakh border that the wind carries dust from two countries at once. From the road, the town could be mistaken for any snow-dusted industrial outpost, gray apartment blocks, a rail line, smoke rising from a salt mine that's operated here for over a century. But drive past the last checkpoint and the landscape changes. Pink-plastered walls rise up, topped with coiled razor wire. Guard towers. Dog handlers pacing the perimeter with animals trained to do one thing only. This is Federal Penitentiary Colony No. 6. Most people who know it at all know it by a different name. Black Dolphin. The fortress itself predates the Soviet Union by more than a century. It was built in the 1770s as an imperial jail, a place to break the men who'd taken up arms during the Pugachev Rebellion. Empires changed, governments collapsed and reformed. But the building kept doing what it was built to do, hold people the state had given up on. After the fall of the USSR, Russia repurposed the site for a single, narrow mission: to warehouse the country's most irredeemable life-sentenced killers, under a level of control that leaves almost nothing to chance. Today, roughly 700 men live inside those walls. Between them, prosecutors say, they're responsible for something in the neighborhood of 4,000 murders. The nickname comes from something almost gentle, a black iron sculpture of a dolphin, welded together by inmates decades ago, standing in the courtyard like a joke the prison tells about itself. Because there is nothing gentle about what happens once you're inside. Cameras run in every cell, every hour, every day. Men are held in steel cages built inside their own cells, a cage within a cage, and whenever a prisoner has to move, to a hearing, to the exercise yard, anywhere, the routine is the same. Guards force him to bend double at the waist. Hands are cuffed behind his back. A blindfold goes on. It isn't for his safety. It's so that after years, sometimes decades, inside the colony, he still couldn't draw you a map of the hallway outside his own cell. He's never allowed to see the sky on the way there. 5 men made that walk over the last 3 decades, and their cases became some of the defining criminal stories of post-Soviet Russia. A man who calmly described butchering people on camera, and once fed a neighbor's family the evidence. A predator whose need for control didn't end at his arrest. He kept manipulating the system from behind bars for 20 years. A killer who watched Russia's most notorious murderer stand trial and decided he wanted the same infamy. A former student who turned an ordinary Tuesday morning into the deadliest school attack Russia had seen in nearly 2 decades, and still couldn't fully explain why. And an inmate who used a work release program, meant to be a second chance, to disappear off the radar of the very system meant to be watching him. This is Prison Files. We've got a new file open 3 times a week. If today's the day you found us, stick around. There's a subscribe button that makes sure you don't miss the next one. Case number 1. Vladimir Nikolayev, the Kabaksari cannibal.
I cut off his head, arms, legs. All of a sudden, something kind of struck me, and I thought I would try it. I gave some meat to one of my friends. She made dumplings with it. She had some herself and fed it to her children.
Kabaksari sits on the Volga River, a mid-sized industrial city that, in the mid-1990s, had bigger problems than crime statistics. The whole country was in economic freefall, and this corner of it was no exception. It's against that backdrop, in 1996, that one of the more disturbing cases in post-Soviet criminal history quietly began, not with a plan, but with a drunken argument that spiraled out of control inside a cramped apartment. Vladimir Nikolayev was unemployed, a heavy drinker, and already known to local police, theft, assault, the kind of record that gets a man written off as a lost cause rather than watched as a danger. He was born in 1959 in the Chuvash Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and by most accounts, his path had been set early, a working-class upbringing, a drift into petty crime through his teens and 20s, short stays in local detention that never seemed to change anything. None of it, on paper, suggested what came next. One night in 1996, drinking with an acquaintance, Nikolayev got into a fight. He knocked the man out cold, And then, instead of the fight simply ending there, something in him decided it wasn't over. He killed him. What Nikolayev did afterward is what separates this case from an ordinary drunken homicide. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He dragged the body to his bathroom, laid it in the tub, and methodically dismembered it with an axe and a kitchen knife, working with the kind of clinical detachment investigators would later say was almost unnervingly calm. And then he did something almost impossible to process. He cooked part of the body in his own kitchen and ate it. What happened with the rest of the remains is the detail that would eventually blow the case open. Nikolayev packaged the leftover meat and carried it to a neighbor's apartment as a gift, telling her it was fresh kangaroo, supposedly picked up from a market that occasionally sold exotic cuts. She had no reason to doubt him. She cooked it for her family. It was her daughter who first said something felt wrong. The taste, the texture, something that didn't sit right, and pushed her mother to take a sample to a doctor rather than shrug it off. That single decision, a teenager trusting her own instinct over a stranger's word, is the reason this case ever reached a courtroom at all. By the time investigators pieced together where that kangaroo meat had actually come from and arrived at Nikolayev's door, they discovered he hadn't stopped at one victim. A second body, killed under similar circumstances, was already being stored in pieces in his balcony freezer, left out in the Volga winter like any other food. When detectives sat him down for questioning, they braced for denial, for excuses, for some kind of psychological collapse. They got none of it. Nikolayev answered every question in a flat, almost bored tone, walking them through the butchering process step by step, as if describing a recipe. When asked why, his answer wasn't rage, or hatred, or trauma. It was curiosity. He said he simply wanted to know what it was like. In 1997, a Russian court convicted him on 2 counts of murder and handed down a death sentence, the outcome that, at the time, felt like the only proportionate response to a crime this far outside ordinary human behavior. But the timing worked against the sentence ever being carried out. Russia was in the process of joining the Council of Europe, and one of the conditions of membership was a moratorium on capital punishment. Nikolayev's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment almost as a formality of international diplomacy, a bureaucratic footnote that let a man who had eaten another human being keep breathing. He was transferred to Black Dolphin shortly after it opened its doors to Russia's most extreme offenders, and there he has remained ever since. What makes Nikolayev's case unusual, even among the 5 men in this file, is what happened years later, when a National Geographic crew was granted the rare privilege of filming inside Black Dolphin. It was Nikolayev who ended up as the face of the documentary, the inmate who agreed to sit in front of the camera, behind double rows of steel bars, and describe what he'd done. Viewers who watched it noted the same thing detectives had noted decades earlier: no visible remorse, no hesitation, the same even, matter-of-fact delivery he'd used in his very first interrogation. It was as if the years inside hadn't changed him at all, only given him a wider audience. Today, Nikolayev is somewhere in his mid-60s, still inside Federal Penitentiary Colony No. 6, still under 24-hour surveillance, still bent double and blindfolded on the rare occasions he leaves his cell. Shabaksuri has moved on. The apartment where it happened is, by most accounts, unremarkable now, indistinguishable from any other on the block. But the case remains one of the touchstones of Russian true crime, not because of the body count, which was comparatively small, but because of exactly how far one man was willing to go and how ordinary he seemed the whole time he was doing it. Case number 2, Oleg Rylkov, the Tolyatti Ripper.
I lured the girl into the forest on the outskirts of the city, and there I killed her.
But you knew that she knew?
Yes,
And you still went through with it?
yes,
So you knew in advance that you would kill her?
yes, exactly.
Tolyatti doesn't get much attention outside Russia, but inside the country it's known as the engine of Soviet, and later Russian, car manufacturing, home to the massive Avtovaz plant that built the Lada. It's a planned industrial city, all wide boulevards and identical apartment blocks, the kind of place built for efficiency rather than character, which made it, for a few terrible years in the 1990s, an unusually easy place for a predator to disappear into. Between 1993 and 1997, women and girls in Tolyatti were being attacked in stairwells, in isolated fields on the edge of the city, in the gaps between one streetlight and the next. There was no obvious pattern connecting the crimes at first. Different neighborhoods, different times of day, different types of victims. That absence of an obvious signature was, in itself, the signature. The man responsible left almost nothing behind. No forensic trail worth speaking of. No consistent method that jumped out at investigators combing through separate case files. The press, once they realized the scale of it, gave him a name that stuck. The Tolyatti Ripper. His actual name was Oleg Rylkov, born in 1966 in the Samara Oblast. If you'd worked alongside him, you likely wouldn't have looked at him twice. Co-workers and neighbors describe someone thoroughly unremarkable, quiet, forgettable. Nothing in his manner that hinted at what he was doing after hours. That ordinariness wasn't an accident. Rylkov operated with a level of method that separates an opportunistic attacker from something more calculated. He targeted a wide range of victims, children as young as 6 alongside grown women, which on its own tells investigators something about the nature of the compulsion driving him. And as his attacks continued, the violence escalated. What began as sexual assault increasingly ended in murder, because a surviving victim was a witness, and a witness was a liability he wasn't willing to leave behind. The spree ran for roughly 4 years before it ended, and it ended almost the way these cases always seem to, because one victim survived and remembered enough. A surviving woman gave detectives details specific enough to finally put a name to the pattern, and in 1997, Rylkov was arrested. When investigators went back through years of unsolved cases with his name in hand, the numbers were staggering. At least 12 murders confirmed, more than 30 separate sexual assaults, and a strong suspicion among the detectives who worked the case that the real total was higher than anything they could prove in court. In 1998, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Like so many others swept up in Russia's moratorium on executions, that sentence became life imprisonment instead, and Rylkov was sent to Black Dolphin not long after. This is where Rylkov's file takes a strange turn, one that says as much about the Russian justice system as it does about the man himself. Life inside a supermax, built to be as close to solitary confinement as a group facility can manage, is, by design, monotonous to the point of psychological erosion. Rylkov found a loophole. Over the following 2 decades, he periodically reached out to prosecutors claiming new memories had surfaced, details about unsolved killings from his old hunting grounds back in the Samara region. Under Russian procedure, a confession like that isn't something investigators can simply take at his word from inside a cell. It requires a formal walkthrough, an on-site reconstruction, which meant transporting Rylkov out of Black Dolphin and back to the towns where he'd once hunted. Whether every one of those recovered memories was genuine is something investigators have quietly debated for years. What's not in dispute is the effect it had on Rylkov's day-to-day existence. Each confession bought him a temporary escape from the 4 walls of his cell, a supervised trip under heavy guard, but a trip nonetheless, a break in a routine that otherwise never varied. For a man serving life without any real hope of release, manipulating cold cases became less about confession and more about currency, a way to purchase brief glimpses of a world he'd otherwise never see again. Rylkov remains in Black Dolphin today, one of the facility's longest-serving inmates. Whether prosecutors in Samara Oblast will ever hear from him again, whether there are more names still locked away, real or invented, waiting to buy him one more trip outside, is something only he knows for certain. Case number 3. Vladimir Mukhankin, Chikatilo's self-appointed heir.
Mukhankin committed his last 2 murders on the same day.
First, he attacked a mother and daughter. An hour later, he took the life of another woman, a guard at a railway depot.
To understand Vladimir Mukhankin, you have to understand the shadow he was standing in. In the same Rostov region where Mukhankin would later kill, Andrei Chikatilo, the so-called Rostov Ripper, one of the most prolific serial killers of the 20th century, had spent over a decade murdering more than 50 people before he was finally caught, and in 1994 executed. Chikatilo's trial had been a national sensation, covered in exhaustive, gruesome detail by a Russian press, finally free to report on organized crime and violence the Soviet system used to suppress entirely. For most people who followed that coverage, it was a story of horror finally ending. For Vladimir Mukhankin, watching from inside the prison system where he was already serving time for robbery and assault, it seems to have read as something else entirely, a challenge. Mukhankin was born in 1960, also in the Rostov region, into a childhood that gave him little reason to expect anything good from the world. Severe physical abuse, neglect, early institutionalization in juvenile reformatories. The kind of biography that shows up again and again in the files of men who go on to commit extreme violence, though of course it explains nothing on its own about why some people who endure it don't. By his early 30s, he'd already cycled through Soviet-era labor camps more than once. It was during one of those stretches behind bars that he followed Chikatilo's case obsessively, and by his own later account, became convinced he could not only match that body count, but exceed it, that he could carve out his own legacy in the same stretch of countryside. He began in February 1995. Whatever restraint had kept him in check before was gone. Armed with knives and blunt weapons, Mukhankin targeted vulnerable people in the same kind of desolate, unwatched terrain Chikatilo had once used. Railroad embankments, deserted fields on the edge of towns, and over roughly 2 months, 8 victims, mostly women and young girls, were found murdered and mutilated. The speed of it is what alarmed investigators most. This wasn't a killer working carefully, spacing out his crimes to avoid detection. This was someone in a hurry, someone who seemed to want the number to climb as fast as possible, almost daring police to catch him before he reached whatever target he'd set for himself. That urgency worked against him. A killer moving that fast, taking that many risks in such a short window, leaves more chances for something to go wrong, and in May 1995, one did. A victim survived his attack and was able to give investigators a description specific enough to identify him. When they arrested Mukhankin, he didn't deny anything. If anything, he seemed to want credit. He told investigators, without prompting, that he considered himself an apprentice of Chikatilo, the word he actually used, and detectives searching his belongings found notebooks filled with violent poetry and writing, a kind of private mythology he'd been building around his own crimes. In 1996, the Rostov Regional Court convicted him on 8 counts of murder and 3 of attempted murder, and sentenced him to death. Like the others in this file, that sentence never carried out. The national moratorium intervened, commuting it to life, and Mukhankin was transferred to Black Dolphin to serve it out. There's a bitter irony in what happened next, one worth sitting with. Mukhankin had wanted infamy. He'd wanted a body count and a name people would say, the way they said Chikatilo's. What he got instead, inside Black Dolphin's walls, was total erasure. No interviews, no notoriety, no audience of any kind, just a strict regime designed specifically to deny men like him the recognition that seemed to have partly motivated them in the first place. He spends his days in near total isolation, decades removed from anyone who might have once feared his name, serving a sentence with no release date and, as far as anyone outside the colony knows, no voice left to tell his story with. Case number 4, Ilnaz Galyaviev, the Kazan school shooter.
Shootings are a rare occurrence in Russia, but on Tuesday, tragedy struck in the city of Kazan, where a lone gunman opened fire at school number 175, killing 7 8th-grade students and 1 teacher.
Some cases in this file are disturbing because of what they reveal about a killer's psychology, an obsession, a pattern built up over years. This one is disturbing for the opposite reason. It took less than 10 minutes, and the person responsible had, until that morning, been almost invisible. Kazan is the capital of Tatarstan, a city of just over 1 million people, and on the morning of May 11th, 2021, it became the site of the deadliest school attack in Russia's post-Soviet history. The attack targeted Gymnasium No. 175, a school with roughly 714 students and 70 staff present at the time. The attacker was a 19-year-old former student of the school named Ilnaz Galyaviev. Galyaviev had graduated from that same school 6 years earlier and had recently been expelled from a local technical college for poor academic performance. Before the attack, he had visited the school unarmed to find out the class schedule and was chased away by the school psychologist. On the morning of the attack, Galyaviev detonated a pipe bomb at the school's entrance, then opened fire with a shotgun. 9 people were killed, 7 of them students and 2 of them teachers, and another 139 people were injured in the chaos that followed, with investigators later recognizing an extraordinary 667 people as victims in the case. He was arrested the same day. What investigators found in the aftermath was, in some ways, more unsettling than the attack itself. No long criminal history, no manifesto circulated to allies, nothing resembling a plan built with anyone else. Investigators said Galyaviev had sought to imitate the actions of members of a destructive subculture he had encountered online, copying their behavior during the attack. During the investigation, he claimed he was God and said he had a monster inside him. That claim triggered a lengthy psychiatric process. Galyaviev was found to be mentally ill after a psychiatric evaluation, despite having no prior diagnosis, but Russia's investigative committee ultimately found him to be of sound mind and fit to stand trial. He pleaded guilty on all counts, including murder, attempted murder, and illegal production and possession of explosives. The investigative committee said he fully admitted his guilt and repented. On April 13, 2023, the Supreme Court of Tatarstan sentenced him to life imprisonment in a special regime penal colony, and an appeals court in Nizhny Novgorod upheld that sentence in August of the same year. Prosecutors also secured a compensation order of roughly 121 million rubles for the victims' families. Unlike some of the men in this file, Galyaviev didn't spend years perfecting a method or hunting in the same stretch of city night after night. His entire case is compressed into a single morning, which is part of why it shook Russia as hard as it did. It was the deadliest school attack in the country since the 2004 Beslan siege, and it happened with almost no warning at all. He is now held at IK-6 in Sol-Iletsk, Orenburg Oblast, better known as Black Dolphin, under the same severe isolation regime applied to the colony's highest-risk inmates. His case resurfaced in headlines again recently, when Russian media reported he had married an 18-year-old journalism student inside the prison, a relationship that reportedly began through letters she started sending him as a teenager shortly after the attack. There's no elaborate psychology to draw out here, no fixation on another killer's legacy, just a former student, a school he once walked the halls of, and 9 people who never got the chance to grow older. Case number 5, Sergei Shipilov, the prisoner who kept killing.
The killer never expressed any remorse or regret. On the contrary, at his trial, he accused the victims' relatives of greed for demanding compensation for moral damages. On October 25, 2000, Shipilov was found guilty of 12 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment.
Of the 5 men held inside Black Dolphin's walls in this file, Sergei Shipilov's case is the one that embarrassed the Russian penal system the most, because for nearly 2 years, the system itself was the reason he got away with it. The story starts in the Volga Oblast, a rural region north of Moscow, where in the mid-1990s, young women began vanishing along country roads and transit routes. At first, these read as the kind of isolated missing persons, cases that rural regions see periodically. A woman who didn't come home, assumed to have simply left, or gotten into trouble that had nothing to do with foul play. It took investigators time to notice the pattern, and even longer to trace it back to its source, because the answer, when they finally found it, wasn't the kind of thing anyone was looking for. Sergei Shipilov, born in 1959, was already a convicted criminal, serving a sentence for rape at an open regime penal colony in the Volga region as of 1995. Open regime colonies operate on a philosophy of graduated trust. Inmates who behave well follow the rules, and show signs of rehabilitation are given increasing freedoms. The idea being that a controlled taste of responsibility helps prepare them to eventually re-enter society. Shipilov, by all appearances, was a model case for that philosophy. He was cooperative, he caused no trouble, and on the strength of that record, prison administrators granted him trusted status as a driver, putting him behind the wheel of trucks, moving goods in and out of the facility's perimeter, largely unsupervised. It's almost impossible to overstate how much freedom that single administrative decision handed him. A man serving a sentence for a violent sexual offense was given a vehicle, a route, and hours at a time, with no direct guard watching what he did with them. Shipilov used that freedom exactly the way you'd fear a man with his history might. Along his delivery routes through rural Volga, he began picking up hitchhikers and vulnerable women traveling alone. People who had no reason to be wary of a truck that, as far as they knew, belonged to a legitimate delivery job. He drove them to secluded, wooded areas away from the road, and then he murdered them, before calmly returning to the penal colony in time to check in for evening roll call, as if nothing at all had happened that day. Between 1995 and 1997, that routine repeated itself again and again. What made it so difficult to catch wasn't cleverness on Shipilov's part so much as a blind spot built into the investigation itself. Detectives working the disappearances were, understandably, looking for a free man, someone who could come and go as he pleased, someone with no fixed schedule tying him down. It never occurred to them, for a long time, that the person they wanted might be clocking in and out of a state institution every single evening. His status as an inmate wasn't a constraint on his crimes. It was his alibi. The case finally broke on forensic evidence rather than a witness or a confession. Tire tracks recovered near a dump site were matched to the specific prison vehicle Shipilov had been assigned to drive. Once investigators had that thread, it unraveled quickly. When he was arrested and confronted with the evidence, Shipilov confessed, and the number he gave them was staggering. 14 women murdered during the period he held trusted status, on top of the earlier violent offense that had put him in the colony in the first place. The fallout went well beyond Shipilov himself. His case forced a nationwide review of Russia's work release and trusted status programs, a reckoning over how a system built to reward good behavior had instead handed a serial killer the exact tools he needed to keep killing, undetected, for 2 years. In 1999, Shipilov was convicted of 14 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. Every privilege he'd once held, the truck, the roots, the trust, was stripped away permanently, and he was sent directly into Black Dolphin's highest level of restriction. His entire existence narrowed down to a single steel cell. There's a particular kind of dread in Shipilov's case that the others in this file don't quite carry, because it isn't really a story about one man's violence. It's a story about how close a functioning bureaucracy can come to enabling exactly the thing it's supposed to prevent. How a policy built on second chances, applied to the wrong person, becomes something closer to a hunting license. Volga changed its procedures because of what Shipilov did. Whether that's enough of a legacy to weigh against 14 lives is a question that case files can't really answer. Every case in this file ends at the same address: Federal Penitentiary Colony No. in a stretch of steppe most of the world will never see. Black Dolphin was never built with rehabilitation in mind, and nobody who runs it pretends otherwise. It exists for one purpose: to hold the men Russia has decided can never be allowed back into the world, for however long they have left to live. What's left, in the end, is simply the record these 5 men made. Vladimir Nikolayev turned his own crime into a kind of performance, one he was still giving decades later, sitting calmly in front of a documentary crew, as if nothing about the moment required any different tone than the one he'd used in his first interrogation. Oleg Rylkov figured out how to bend a rigid system to his own advantage, trading cold case confessions, real or not, for brief, supervised glimpses of a world he'd otherwise never see again. Vladimir Mukhankin wanted to inherit a body count and a name that Russia would remember the way it remembered Chikatilos, and got instead total silence and a cell no one ever visits. Ilnaz Galyaviev needed less than 10 minutes to become the author of the deadliest school attack in post-Soviet Russia, and left investigators with nothing resembling a real motive, only a claim, made under questioning, that he was God. And Sergei Shipilov exposed exactly how far a system built on second chances can be turned against the people it's supposed to protect, driving a prison truck to 14 more crime scenes before anyone thought to look twice at him. The Black Iron Dolphin is still standing in that courtyard, exactly where the inmates who built it left it. Guards still walk the double steel corridors on the same 15-minute rotation they've kept for decades. The blindfolds go on the same way. The bent double walk to and from the exercise yard hasn't changed. For the 5 men in this file, and the hundreds of others serving out their lives alongside them, the world outside effectively ended the day the doors of Correctional Colony No, 6 closed behind them, whether or not their bodies are still inside it. That's this file. Closed, if there's a case or a facility you want us to open next, drop it in the comments below. We read every one, and a good number of episodes on this channel started exactly that way.